inspiration, motivation and ideas behind my art practice, which really will centre around questions related to belonging. And as an artist, I often think about beauty, which is defined as having properties of harmony, truthfulness and originality. And harmony is defined as combinations of elements which naturally belong together, which leads me to question, is endemic biodiversity therefore inherently beautiful? And is a connection with your own endemic biodiversity essential for a true sense of place and belonging? And can art be a tool which can help nurture it? Today's overarching theme of ideas from the edge is certainly something I feel tuned into, because my ideas all started here, way out on the edge. 11 years ago, my partner Richard and I bought a gorgeously wild mallee property on the south coast of Kangaroo Island, and the arrow is pointing at our shed. And because there are no foxes or rabbits on Kangaroo Island, the remaining bush is really dense and teeming with wildlife, so it's like going back in time. And it was actually the last piece of the Australian coastline to be mapped by the explorers, and this is Flinders' map from 1802, and it's got an arrow pointing at our future shed, but with the coastlines a bit fudged. As quickly as we could, we put the property under a state government heritage agreement, and it's now known officially as Boobook Hill Reserve. And we spent countless hours eradicating the weeds from the edges of the property that were sort of threatening to invade the bush. And the big picture scenery was impressive, but we wanted to learn all we could about the details of what made it tick. And Richard's an entomologist, and in his private time over the past decade, he's made a private collection of over 20,000 insects, all perfectly pinned and labelled and extensively databased. It's quite amazing. My task was the plants, which fortunately was slightly easier because there's certainly less of them and they don't move. So I decided to make a plant herbarium, and it was interesting hearing Emily talk about the beagle, because we have herbarium samples in our state herbarium that were collected on that beagle voyage. So as each plant flowered, I'd collect samples which would be pressed and dried and stitched to a piece of card, and I'd identify them in reference books and then label and order them in an old Danish collecting cabinet which I'd found. And within a year I had over 100 specimens from the property. But we were also able to observe wonderful animals like our blonde echidnas and bushstone curlews and Tamar wallabies, and the goannas, which would wander into the shed and quickly lose their cool when their toenails would catch on the carpet loops, which is quite funny. And we'd also observe the juvenile goannas, where they'd emerge from those domed termite mounds where their mothers lay the eggs to incubate. And we put nest boxes up in the trees, which were quickly occupied by families of western pygmy possums, which are the size of a mouse but with bigger eyes and curly tails and a pouch, obviously. And you can see in this photo the mothers brought in leaves of Eucalyptus nervifolia as nesting material. And there's meant to be over 700 species of eucalypts in Australia, but this one's meant to have the highest oil content. So we were so excited by all of this, particularly the complexity and the interconnected relationships. There was an overwhelming sense of everything belonging. And I'll just share one example. There's a plant on our property called Corytrum glomeratum, which is the yellow waxy bush you can see there in the foreground. And it's actually a root parasite onto plants of the Myrtaceae family, so it needs to latch onto a eucalypt or a melaleuca to survive. And at a particular time of year, the butterfly Agara satanis lays a clutch of eggs at the base of this bush, but only if there's the entrance to the nest of the nocturnal ant Camponotus terebrans. And instead of eating the eggs as you'd expect, the ants take the eggs down into their chamber and look after the hatched larvae. And at night, attendant ants lead it up onto the bush to feed, and when we come along with the sort of flash of cameras and our glamorous head torches, they quickly lead the larvae back down again to safety. So it's a symbiotic collaborative relationship where the ants receive sugar secretions from the larvae and the larva gets protection from predators and parasitoids. And eventually, after a pupal stage, the adult butterfly emerges. And it did used to be reasonably common on the mainland, but it's now rarely seen due to habitat loss. So that was my inspiration, observing the incredible harmony, originality and beauty of things which belong together. So on to my motivation, which could also be called my rant, which came from observing things which didn't belong. Because with my head full of these amazing things, I'd have the jarring experience of returning to the garden city of Adelaide, which might look green and pretty to some taste, but in terms of endemic biodiversity, it's a complete wasteland. Gardens are filled with roses, Italian pencil pines, frizzled tropical palms, agapanthus, petunias, London plane trees and ornamental pears. They are completely out of place. To me, they look awkward, garish, and often pitiful, being a world away from their own natural comfort zones. I see nothing harmonious, truthful, or original. It's a grab bag of alien species from around the globe. It's a poor imitation and a false ecological desert. And I believe it breeds environmental ignorance and even arrogance, I could say. And even flowers labelled native at the local florist are mainly South African species, with maybe a Banksia dyed a garish bright blue if you're lucky. And you might say our parklands are full of native species, but they're not necessarily local. Most species, like these Western Australian coral gums, are from thousands of kilometres away, along with the token plantings of kangaroo paws which have popped up recently. Our hillsides are covered with olives, blackberries, Watsonia and boneseed. I'd go to the beach with my friends and I'd sort of get out of the car and moan in horror, look at the weeds. But even more horrifying was their response. Where? Because all we could see were African gazanias literally covering the dunes and outcompeting a dozen local species. What a sad situation, that most people would struggle to identify what plants are native, let alone whether they're a local species. And it's hardly surprising with only 2% of Adelaide's natural vegetation remaining, if you don't count the mangroves. And a few years ago I decided to plant a garden of purely local native species which would have grown on the property before settlement. And in 1836 there were over 1,000 plant species on the Adelaide Plains, supporting 290 species of birds, 40 mammals, 56 reptiles, 11 freshwater fish and tens of thousands of invertebrates. So I made a long list from these reference books but couldn't find any of these plants in the local nurseries. But I could see plenty of punnets of those Ferrule gazanias I'd seen escaping from the gardens into the dunes. So eventually I sought out a specialist who had over 100 beautiful, cheap local plant species to choose from. Just think, they've undergone hundreds of thousands of years of rigorous product testing. And my garden has boomed despite absolutely no care from me. No watering, no chemicals, no fancy pruning. The plants obviously belong there. And I think the effect is beautiful. And I was thrilled the other day to see a striated pardalote picking insects off of my sticky hop bushes. And I just love to see a renaissance of endemic native gardens spreading across our suburbs. And volunteers and organisations who've begun this work should be strongly supported, because unfortunately they're often opposed by uninformed residents who have little understanding of how their own whims affect the environment as a whole. Because there's a tragic disconnect, and it started on day one. In 1836, when the first home settlers nailed the proclamation notice to the tree, it was a symbolic first nail in the coffin for South Australia's biodiversity. The Aboriginal community, who'd been its devoted caretakers for over 40,000 years, were completely devastated, and tragically so was the wealth of their knowledge and management skills. A telling quote from 1902 says, "Nobody knows who made the mallee, but the devil is highly suspected." But have attitudes changed, or have we just separated ourselves from it? Our native biodiversity has been ruthlessly pushed out past the edges of our communities, and for some species to the edge of extinction and beyond. We have an appalling record, as we just heard. And many people seem to think the bush only belongs in national parks, yet even there its integrity is compromised by feral weeds and animals and honeybees, which we've carelessly unleashed to wreak havoc on the environment. The trouble is, I believe if the community have no connection with their biodiversity and no sense of pride or ownership, they won't feel driven to conserve it, let alone restore it. There's no sense of ethical responsibility. And I guess you could ask, does it even matter? Well, Richard, my partner, is a molecular entomologist, and he would say our biodiversity is a giant toolbox which holds secrets to our very survival. I also wonder, is it healthy to live apart from functioning complex biodiversity and to only see vegetation brought about by our clumsy attempts to reconfigure nature to suit only human needs and narrow cultural aesthetics? And surely in such a diverse society, our collective identity and sense of belonging should come from an understanding of the place and the land itself, including the endemic life. So how could I help connect the community with their own natural heritage? How could I stop them in their busy tracks and force them to see the wonderful details? Well, I believe art isn't simply a decoration or ornamentation, and that its visual poetry has the power to engage and direct society. So I decided to create art with a contemporary Australian aesthetic, to provide a window on the natural world that would ignite a sense of wonderment, invite sustained contemplation and inspire conservation. And to do it, I'd collaborate with the biodiversity itself. I decided to use the traditional herbarium techniques, which I was already familiar with, so the ideas and inspiration come directly from the materials themselves. They provide the colour, the texture, the form, and even the narrative, and I simply assemble them to show off those unique characteristics and to honour and celebrate them. These leaves have been chewed by nocturnal beetles and patterned by leaf miners which live underneath the surface. And I didn't see them at work, but I say we collaborated, and I'm sure they'd support my motives. To me, the ragged edges add visual energy and show interactions at work in the landscape. And I often include man-made objects because I'm wanting to talk about man's relationship with the landscape. And although we seem to disregard our biodiversity, we've certainly embraced our mineral wealth. Yet the objects I find rusting in the landscape seem to speak of the fragility of our existence. Acacia pycnantha is commonly known as the golden wattle, and it's Australia's national floral emblem. But instead of the showy sort of flowers, I wanted to use the dead twigs, which have a fabulous zigzag form where the leaf stems have fallen off. And the Aboriginal community used the gum and the seeds and the bark from this species for food and medicine and tool making. And it's actually a serious weed in South Africa, so it shows that it does go both ways. And one day I had collected gum nuts from Eucalyptus diversifolia trees into just a tiny little box. And when I went to use them a few months later, I found that this phenomenal amount of seed had fallen out. And it was staggering to me to think of those trees pouring out seeds season after season, possibly for hundreds of years, and providing such a huge resource to be eaten by insects and birds. And so the arrangement I've made sort of plays on the ripple effect of life radiating across the landscape. As you can see, I often use the circular shape or the mandala. And I guess it's a simple calming shape with so much busyness going on inside it, but it also provides that sense of unity and belonging which I'm trying to foster. I'm also playing with scale because it reminds me of the kinds of things you see under a microscope or through a telescope, whether it's a grain of pollen or a planet. There's that amazing infinity of nature. And ants are quintessentially Australian. We have a hell of a lot of them. There are over 1,300 described species. And here I've used sand from the entrance to an ant nest. And on our property we have ant nests as big as rooms, and they're incredibly impressive, particularly when you remember we're just seeing that single exterior plane. And I've also used Acacia pycnantha twigs again, and also the seeds in the centre which the ants take down into their nest for the valuable protein. And I've also used bones, and it might sound macabre, but there are dead animals on our property which we've been observing for over 10 years. And I wanted to introduce the idea of awesome beauty and connectedness even in death. Because first we see magnificent wedge-tailed eagles fly down to feast, and then jewel-like beetles with fabulous names like the Devil's Coachman. And sometimes there'll be a melancholy little mound of fine grass from their last day of feeding. And then iridescent moss and orange lichen start to grow on the bones. And the bones, which used to make sense when they were together, become more of a puzzle once they've scattered. And the snail shell you can also see there is actually a Ferrule introduced pest. And you often see it gathered on tree trunks and fence posts in dry weather, and they appear to be dead but are in that state of estivation which can last for many, many years. So although it's an animal here, it's actually representing man's influence on the landscape, which does seem to be ever present. And I'm obviously visually playing on the idea of the entrance and the exit to the nest, but also the beginning and ending of life. This piece uses leaves which have degraded to varying degrees, and it talks about time and seasons and change and, again, beauty and decay. And the markings, which might be a bit hard to see there, they're actually from lerp insects, which are also quintessentially Australian. And to deal with our dry conditions, they make waxy, sugary coverings over themselves, and the sugar was actually a source of food for Aboriginal people as well. And as with all my pieces, it's the idea of taking so-called ordinary things, and by placing them on a crisp white background on a gallery wall, you're showing how truly extraordinary they really are. Like a simple eucalyptus leaf that's so hard and waxy and oil-filled and perfectly suited to Australian conditions, and it supports so much life, which is why it's actually hard to find a perfect eucalyptus leaf in the bush. But even if you look at a big old eucalypt in the parklands, you'll actually, if you look closely enough, you'll see it supporting hundreds of species of insects, let alone all the other animals. Yet a European pine just a few metres away will have very, very few. Marine biodiversity is obviously a huge concern, and there's been a lot of fuss about the proposed marine parks, yet from what I understand, breeding zones around the world have proved to be very successful. And I hate to think where we'd be if parks on the land weren't declared years ago. These pink shells are all one species from one beach on Kangaroo Island. And I love the fact that they are all the same, but they're all different. They're like individuals in a collective grouping. And it doesn't matter whether it's shells or stars or people, it's the subtle differences which make them interesting. You can see that they've all had their individual histories and been affected by location and time and other creatures. Oh, have I gone forward? No. People often say my pieces remind them of the iris of an eye, and I'm quite happy with that idea because I am trying to give a new vision on the bush. And again, these leaves have been chewed by beetles, and I'm constantly fascinated with the way there's such subtle variations in nature, like the way a particular species of insect will chew a particular species of leaf, and there's quite different techniques out there, and if you put hundreds of one kind together, they give off quite a different resonance. And it's amazing to me the fact that some insects do live out their whole life on a leaf, and that is their world and their sense of scale. This piece is made from the seeds of the drooping she oak, and they have a wonderful translucent wing on them like insects. And the seeds which you find inside the cones are actually the main food source of the endangered glossy black cockatoo. And the soft young cones were eaten by Aboriginal people, and the seeds were used as medicine. And a 10,000-year-old boomerang was found in a South Australian swamp, and it was made from the wood of this species. And I've used a rusted circular saw blade in the middle, which I've found and coated with salt, to represent the way the clearing of the trees in the Australian landscape has caused so much devastating salinity. I've also replicated the Fibonacci spiral with the seeds, which you can either see as the sawdust flying, but again, the infinity of nature and its patterns. This piece uses golden wattle twigs again, and it talks about Australia's weather system, which swings like a giant pendulum from droughts to floods and back again. And you can either see it as the mirage of the heat or the water of the floods. And I love the way the 3D materials make shadows, and it seems to sort of double the effect. And if you get to actually live with a piece, you can sort of see the light moving across the room, and it sort of makes them seem alive. This is the last piece which I'll show you today, and it's got... you can see the effects of dozens of insect species if you can actually see it in the reel. And it's actually from, the leaves are from my parents' property in the Murray Mallee. And it actually won the People's Choice Award of the Blake Prize in Sydney, which is Australia's major art prize for religious and spiritual art. And the tour guides from the Blake Society told me that many people became very emotional in front of it and even crying. So is this a sign? Maybe people's souls are crying out for a way to connect and belong to this country. Bill Gammage has recently published a wonderful book called The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia. And he discusses their dreaming as a great intellectual achievement to shackle body and soul to the survival of all things in heaven and earth, making environmental management obligatory. He says, "We have a continent to learn. If we are to survive, let alone feel at home, we must begin to understand our country. If we succeed, one day we might become Australian." In 2 weeks' time, 16 of my pieces will go on display here in Adelaide, and it's a chance for me to share the joy I have for our unique natural heritage, and the beauty is certainly in the details. The pieces are a window on my world, way out on the edge, and a window into the past. But I hope you go along and see them and be inspired to nurture a place for our biodiversity here and now. I'm sure you'll find an abundant sense of belonging. Thank you.